Hello, everyone. I'm Jeremy Johnson, dramaturg at Houston Grand Opera, and welcome to HGO Digital's live pre-show and our final one of the 2020-2021 season. For those of you who've been with us before, welcome back, and thank you for being with us throughout the year. And for those who are joining us for the first time, welcome to our pre-show event. I hope you have a great time learning a bit more about our digital programming. Tonight, we're in for a real treat. This is the place where we will introduce you to tonight's performance and give you some background on what you will see and hear. The main event begins at 7:30 Central on hgo.org/digital or through our partners at Marquee TV. So make sure you're ready to watch on one of those platforms. Tonight's performance of Hansel and Gretel, like all of our HGO digital presentations, is generously underwritten by Sarah and Ernest Butler, and we are deeply, deeply grateful for their support this season. The performance will go live at 7:30 Central on hgo.org/digital. Let me take a minute to remind all of you watching here on Facebook or YouTube that this video you're watching now, if you're hearing me say these words, this video is not where the opera is going to take place. This is our pre-show stream. The opera itself will be streamed on HGO's website and through Marquee TV. So you have three options for watching the performance tonight. One, download the Marquee TV app on your smart device, including your smart TV, and create a login. Two, you can go directly to marquee.tv in a web browser. Simply create a login. You can access the performance there for free tonight. Or three, go to hgo.org/digital. Use your HGO login credentials or create an HGO login, and you can watch tonight's performance for free there as well. So make sure you're logged in and ready to go. And if you have any questions or comments during the pre-show tonight, feel free to type them into the comment boxes directly on Facebook or YouTube. We'll be able to see them and respond on here live. So let's talk a little bit more about tonight's opera. Hansel and Gretel premiered in Weimar, Germany in 1893. Music composed by Engelbert Humperdinck to a libretto by Adelheid Wette. Humperdinck and Wette were brother and sister. Wette being Adelheid's married name from her husband, Hermann Wette. She was 4 years younger than her brother, and they began writing Hansel and Gretel in April of 1890, when she was 31 and Engelbert was 35. The background of how this piece got started is pretty fun and interesting. Adelheid and her husband, Hermann, were both authors and poets, and every year, Adelheid wrote a play for her kids to perform at a big family celebration. In 1890, she wrote a series of dramatic poems that was more or less a new play of Hansel and Gretel, a folktale that had been around for quite some time by then, that her children would perform for her husband's birthday in the spring. She wrote a letter to her brother asking him to set some of those poems to music, which he had done 2 years earlier for a version of Snow White that she had written. And of course, this time he graciously agreed again. But unlike the 1888 Snow White, which remained a play of dramatic poems with some of them set to music, Hansel and Gretel, from 1890 to its premiere in 1893, morphed over time into a full 3-act German romantic opera. Adelheid's husband, Hermann, whose birthday celebration started the whole project, was also a part of putting it together with the brother and sister duo. He was also an established author and poet, and he had already begun work with composer Arnold Mendelssohn on the first of their 2 operas together. So Hansel and Gretel started as a family play for the librettist's husband's birthday for their kids to perform. Her brother wrote some music to some of the poetry, but then, being a very creative and artistic family, they kept adding music and rewriting and restructuring, and soon the play became what we call a German Singspiel. Humperdinck had set songs with set beginnings and endings, and between them there was spoken dialogue, as in a play. But they continued their revisions of the piece, and soon it became a through-composed full opera, one that had entirely music sung throughout, and one that has become one of the most frequently performed operas in history. In fact, it was the very first opera to be performed in a complete radio broadcast by the Metropolitan Opera on Christmas Day of 1931, and the first opera to be broadcast in its entirety on television, which was on December 23rd, 1943, exactly 50 years from the date of its premiere. Interestingly, The piece has always been associated with December and Christmas time, and tends to be considered a quote-unquote holiday opera. But the plot is not explicitly about Christmas. A cannibalistic witch who bakes children isn't really in the holiday spirit. Nor does it even explicitly take place around any winter holiday, nor even necessarily during the winter season. And actually, when you think about the fact that Hansel and Gretel are sent out into the forest to pick strawberries in the Harz Mountains in Germany, which would be covered in snow during winter, and strawberries grow in June, we can say with near certainty that the opera, in fact, does not take place during winter or around the holiday season. But the opera is considered a holiday tale, and always has been, purposefully premiering 2 days before Christmas, because the fairy tale, over time, became associated with Christmas. And that, I'll explain a little bit more tonight, that has everything to do with gingerbread. The first traces of the folktale come from the late medieval era, around the 13th or 14th century. But it wasn't ever compiled or written down until the Brothers Grimm published their book of collected German folklore in 1812. So there's at least 500 years of oral history, with the story pulling different thematic material from different folklore over the centuries. And what the Brothers Grimm wrote down in 1812 has become the standard version of the story. Adelheid Wette, being a folklorist herself, as well as a poet and author, drew on the folktale as written down by the Grimms. But there are some very notable differences between the opera and the tale. So as I go through a little bit of the plot for you and explain how and why gingerbread is pretty much the only reason it's a Christmas opera, I'm going to reference 3 different time periods. 1, the medieval themes of the early traces of the folktale. 2, the 1812 folktale as written down by the Brothers Grimm. And 3, the 1893 opera libretto. Let's start right in the middle with the 1812 folktale. It's a story of poverty and desperation. During a famine, a woodcutter is unable to put enough food on the table for him, his wife, and their 2 children. He asks his wife what they should do, and she convinces him that they should bring their children deep into the forest and leave them there to either fend for themselves or to die in the forest. It's a pretty gruesome start to a quote-unquote children's story. It comes, though, from the medieval themes of the folktale's origins. It was not uncommon for children to be abandoned in the Middle Ages. Poverty was the main driver for that, but even as late as the 17th century, some records show as many as 15% of children in even the wealthiest areas of France were abandoned. Throughout most of the Middle Ages, there were no laws against it, up until about the 12th or 13th century, when the first child abandonment laws started to be written. Child abandonment was so common, in fact, that Pope Innocent III set up revolving doors in orphanages and hospitals so that people could leave their children anonymously without facing any social repercussions, and slowly throughout the era, any starting to be developed legal repercussions. And so that's how and why child abandonment became a pretty common literary theme throughout medieval era folklore. Now, those of you who are very familiar with Hansel and Gretel may or may not have noticed that when introducing the 1812 version, I said the woodcutter and his wife and their children. The medieval story, all the way through the Brothers Grimm writing it down, did include the biological mother as the mother figure. It was only during the Brothers Grimm's many revisions, they went through about 17 different editions of their fairy tale anthologies, that the mother figure over time became Hansel and Gretel's stepmother. This was an intentional Christianization of the tale, and not just by the Brothers Grimm, but by many tellings and retellings of the tale from the medieval era through the 19th century, as an attempt to make the mother's abandonment of the children more palatable to the Christian family model. The common trope of the evil stepmother grew out of that desire to idolize the family model. The common occurrence of a mother's death during childbirth often led to an inability of the family to raise the child, and then logically to child abandonment. But in such a strong patriarchal society in Europe, the father couldn't have been the one to abandon his child. It must have been his second wife who convinced him to do something so immoral. But despite the reality that poverty and desperation drove biological mothers and biological fathers to abandon their children, The early modern era Christianization of folklore led to that trope of the evil stepmother. Even some very early variations of Snow White, the one where the stepmother sends a hunter to go rip out the heart of her stepdaughter for her to eat it to become immortal. Even that began as the biological mother as well. So the medieval origins of Hansel and Gretel were as biological mother. The early modern era variations morphed it into the stepmother. The Brothers Grimm and their 17 anthology editions sometimes had mother, sometimes stepmother. But Adelheid Wette, a loving mother whose children were meant to perform this play for their father's birthday, intentionally removed the child abandonment motif from the story entirely. The mother figure is their biological mother, and they do still live in poverty, but in the opera, she's not trying to abandon them in the forest. She's just sending them out to go pick some strawberries. She's doing so in anger because they didn't do their chores while she was out, but at least she's not trying to abandon them in the forest. If you've ever heard any version of Hansel and Gretel, you'll probably recognize the phrase trail of breadcrumbs. The opera doesn't contain that either, because those breadcrumbs are explicitly tied to the children trying to find their way home after being abandoned. So without the child abandonment motif, there's no need for the breadcrumb motif. In the folktale, Hansel overhears the mother or stepmother figure convincing the father to leave the children in the forest. And so the next morning, he gathers as many pebbles as he can in his pocket and drops the pebbles along their way into the forest in order to follow those back home. In the parents' second attempt to leave their children in the forest after following the pebbles was successful, the kids aren't able to collect any pebbles in the second attempt because the mother locked them in the house so that they couldn't. They found a small crust of bread to leave the trail of breadcrumbs through the forest. But the birds eat the breadcrumbs, so they're never actually able to find their way home, and that's how they get lost in the forest and stumble upon the witch's house. In the opera libretto, getting lost in the forest is chalked up to night falling. While out picking berries, they play games, accidentally eat all the berries that they picked, and then it gets too dark for them to find their way home. So they sleep overnight in the forest, are visited by 14 angels in a dream, and then they stumble upon the witch's house the next morning. So the witch's house is basically the only reason the tale and the opera are associated with Christmas. The medieval origins of the tale don't call it a gingerbread house, or whatever the medieval German word for what we now call gingerbread would have been. The oldest versions of the tale simply refer to the witch's house as a house made of bread. This is part of that overarching theme of poverty in the piece. They don't have enough bread at home for the whole family. The kids are starving, and the parents abandon them in order to survive. Hansel even tries to use what tiny piece of bread they can find to find their way back home, to a home that has no more bread. Of course, in the forest, that house made of bread is too good to be true, which is a rejection of the thought process that abandoning the children was better for them and they would be more likely to survive by a random benefactor finding the kids and taking care of them, which was, in the medieval era, a hope of many of the parents who abandoned their children, a false hope. And that's something that this folklore hints at, that that's really too good to be true. So again, it comes back to poverty, that the house in the oldest versions of the tale was simply made out of breads and cakes and pastries. It wasn't specifically gingerbread until probably right around the time the Brothers Grimm wrote the story down. And I'm using the term gingerbread to refer to the modern English translation of the German word Lebkuchen, which is a honey-sweetened spiced bread or cookie, which is different from the molasses-sweetened gingerbread found in England, which was much crisper and crunchier and seems to have been the predecessor of the modern ginger snap. Now, I am a frequent eater of, but I am not an expert on ginger-spiced treats, so let's just accept that at some point in history, the English gingerbread and the German Lebkuchen were used in much the same traditions and for much the same celebratory purpose, despite being slightly different recipes. And they've been conflated enough over time that the English word for the German Lebkuchen is gingerbread. So you've undoubtedly heard of Gingerbread Men, cookies made of gingerbread in the shape of a humanoid figure. That tradition is credited to Queen Elizabeth I of England, who in the 16th century would have gingerbread cakes baked in the shape and likeness of her royal guests. So molding gingerbread, or Lebkuchen, became increasingly popular throughout Europe, no matter if you're using a honey-sweetened or a molasses-sweetened recipe. And this, I'll point out, as it was gaining in popularity, is actually a few hundred years a few hundred years after the medieval origins of the fairy tale, which did not contain a gingerbread house, simply a bread house. But molding gingerbread and Lebkuchen into different shapes and figures was really popular in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and it became a specialized cookie that were sold as gifts, wedding presents, and holiday treats. This is where gingerbread, and therefore the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel, become rather holiday specific. Gingerbread baking formed into professional bakers' guilds, and in many European areas, you could only buy gingerbread from a professional baker. But an exception was made around Christmas and Easter. So gingerbread was a year-round treat, but at Christmas, anyone and everyone could make it at home. So it became more and more associated with Christmas, and gingerbread shaping became a Christmas tradition. So when the Brothers Grimm wrote down the folktale in the early 19th century, gingerbread shaping was already a big Christmas tradition, and the origins of the tale's witch's house, simply made of any type of bread or pastry or cake, evolved into gingerbread. And so we get the Christmas-associated theme of the gingerbread house. Really nothing else about the tale or the opera are winter or holiday themed, so to me, it really must be the gingerbread house. Even though the house's occupant, again, is a cannibalistic witch who bakes impoverished children who are abandoned in the forest by their parents, really in the holiday spirit. The scenes with the witch in the opera are pretty similar across different variations of the story, from its medieval origins to the 19th century Brothers Grimm anthology to the 1893 opera libretto. They all involve the witch wanting to fatten up one or both of the kids, and when attempting to bake one of the two, is outsmarted in some way and pushed into the oven and baked herself. Of course, if she's baked into bread or gingerbread is part of the difference. And in some versions, there are other children that are freed by her death. Children that had already been baked into bread or gingerbread are freed back into human children. The Brothers Grimm and the opera libretto refer to Lebkuchenkinder, gingerbread children. And at the end of the Brothers Grimm version of the fairy tale, Hansel and Gretel steal the witch's valuables, ride a swan back home, and return home only to their father. Their stepmother has died of some unexplained cause, and with the witch's riches, the family is out of poverty and freed from the evil stepmother who tried to abandon the children in the forest. Now, this is a not-so-subtle allegory for the stepmother and the witch being somehow intertwined in the story. That when the witch who seduces the starving children with food is killed, so too does the evil stepmother who also didn't care for the children's well-being. Sometimes, even in the opera, the mother and the witch are performed by the same singer. I personally find that casting a little odd, just because Adelheid Wette clearly went to great lengths not to conflate the biological mother figure with the evil witch figure. But it is possible to perform that way in the score. We don't in this version. Tonight, the mother is played by HGO studio mezzo Lindsay Kate Brown, and the witch is played by HGO studio alumnus tenor Richard Trace Mager. In the telling of the tale that does equate those two characters, though, the stepmother and the witch, the father in that version, the symbol of the head of the household, the Christianized patriarchal family model, he's been tricked by the stepmother, and he spent the whole tale away from Hansel and Gretel, lamenting the fact that they're away from home, away from his safety. And when they return, the three of them all live happily ever after, no longer in poverty because they ran away with the witch's jewels. Now, in the opera, Hansel and Gretel don't ride a swan home, and their mother isn't dead. Their mother and their father, who immediately at the end of the first act went to go find the children in the forest, the children, and the revived gingerbread children, who are now human again, they sing a short closing ode celebrating the end of the witch and giving thanks to God with a recurring literary and musical theme that returns throughout the piece. Now, that theme, which I'll say for you now in the English singing translation that we'll perform tonight, which is by Sir David Pountney, that literary theme is this: when in need or dark despair, God will surely hear your prayer. So listen for the text and for the music associated with that text throughout the opera. It comes back a number of times. So Adelheid Wette, in constructing a family play of poetry out of this folktale, did remove the evil stepmother and did remove the child abandonment motifs, brought the tale back to that poverty, desperation, and yet a determination to survive together as a family. And that informed a lot of the visual aesthetic in Liliana Blaine Cruz's film production with visual designer and artist Hannah Wasilewski. In this film's visuals, which are entirely drawn and animated, Hansel and Gretel live in a modern bayou town in incredible poverty. You'll see their house falling apart, their clothes in tatters, and you'll see that juxtaposed with the overly decadent southern plantation antebellum style home of the witch's gingerbread house. It's not just that the witch has candy and sweets, or even just the witch has food that the family doesn't have. It's that the witch has everything the family doesn't have. And there are a lot more layers in the visual imagery, which is why is the gingerbread house in that antebellum architecture? It looks very much like the infamous Oak Alley plantation in Louisiana. Who are the 14 angels, those images in the children's dream sequence? How do those interact with intersections of poverty and race to comment on a lot of the conversations we're having right now around the history of the current society and economy in the world, especially in the context of what Hansel and Gretel as a fairy tale is fundamentally all about, which is poverty, and who has access to, or has inherited, or who controls access to different resources. So turn that part of your brain on as you enjoy Hansel and Gretel tonight. Think about what it really means. Why is there a folk tale that exists about child abandonment, intense poverty and hunger, an evil solitary figure that seems to own everything? Certainly more than the protagonists could ever dream of, and certainly more resources than the antagonist needs to survive. And that perspective certainly brings a whole new layer, I think, in this opera to the meaning of the opera's finale and the famous Jean-Jacques Rousseau quote during the French Revolution: "Quand le peuple n'aura plus rien à manger, il mangera la riche," which I think is a poignant quote for the end of Hansel and Gretel. Let's talk some of the music of Hansel and Gretel, composed by Adelheid's brother, Engelbert Humperdinck. This is the late 19th century German romantic composer, not the mid-20th century Vegas crooner, who did, though, take a stage name from the composer of Hansel and Gretel. Hansel and Gretel premiered in 1893. It was Humperdinck's first full-length opera. He wrote about half a dozen more in his career, the only other relatively well-known one being Königskinder in 1897, and his last piece coming in 1919, Gaudeamus. Arnold Schoenberg's Erwartung was written in 1909, so serialism and atonalism had emerged during Humperdinck's career. But Humperdinck didn't really experiment in that style and stuck mainly to the late Romantic musical aesthetic that he inherited and learned directly from Richard Wagner. In the first few years of the 1880s, a young Humperdinck worked at Bayreuth as an assistant to Wagner during the composition and production of his final opera, Parsifal. An interesting thing to learn is that Humperdinck's opera Königskinder from 1897 is the earliest still existing piece on record that contains a technique called Sprechstimme, a half-singing, half-speaking vocal technique used extensively by Schoenberg, Berg, and other German composers of the early 20th century who composed in serialism techniques. Though Humperdinck never really wrote in serialism, he seems to have started, or at least was among the earliest composers of Sprechstimme. And there's no Sprechstimme in Hansel and Gretel, and it stays very much in the German Romantic opera tradition, whose literary and musical characteristics include being based on folklore, having big orchestras with more brass instruments, and using musical leitmotifs that reappear throughout the opera. Hansel and Gretel has all of those characteristics. But it's also worth listening for the progression of the opera's composition when you watch it. Remember, it started as setting some dramatic poems to music for his sister's family play. Then they lengthened it and added some more with some spoken dialogue to make it a Singspiel. And then they finally turned it into a full 3-act opera. And you can hear some elements of all of that in the music. The very first bars of music that Gretel sings are a little folk song that she's singing to herself while she and Hansel try to do their chores while their parents are gone. It actually was an existing folk song that Humperdinck repurposed for the opera, Zuse liebe Zuse. There are many other musical moments in the piece that sound like standalone folk tunes. Humperdinck only repurposed one existing folk tune, and the rest are his own compositions. But you can hear in the music that Humperdinck started composing this opera as simply setting some of his sister's poems to music for her children to perform. While lost in the forest, for example, Hansel and Gretel are visited by 2 different magical beings, the Sandman to help them fall asleep, and the Dew Fairy to help them wake up. These 2 characters only appear each for their short arias, again, simple folk-like songs. When Act 2 opens and Hansel and Gretel are picking berries in the forest, Gretel sings another little children's song to herself. So listen for that musical aspect of Humperdinck's score, the emphasis on folk-inspired tunes and simple children's songs, which would have been informed by the history of his composition of this piece. And lastly, what I want you to listen for in this opera is a musical theme that first appears in the very first notes you hear. This is the theme I referenced earlier tonight. When the orchestra starts the overture, the very first music you hear, pay close attention to that musical phrase and listen for it throughout the evening. It comes back over and over again throughout the opera. And the first time it is sung with words. It is a musical reference that Gretel makes to a saying her father always reminds them of. And that's the saying we spoke about earlier. When in need or dark despair, God will always hear our prayer. The theme returns in the evening prayer when Hansel and Gretel pray before falling asleep in the forest, and when they're protected by 14 angels surrounding them while they sleep. And it returns at the very end of the piece when the family has survived together from the witch and freed the Lebkuchenkinder from their gingerbread forms. Thank you, everyone, for joining me tonight for the pre-show. This is our last HGO digital performance of the season, and so therefore our last digital pre-show for the season. We've recently announced our live performances for the 2021-22 season, so please visit hgo.org to learn more about subscribing to our next season. I hope you all will join us in the Wortham for those of you in Houston or nearby, or who just want to fly in for a great weekend of opera in Houston, Texas, now that we can finally be back together in person. Please visit hgo.org to learn more about that. And now it's time for the opera to go live on Marquee TV and hgo.org/digital. So make sure you're logged in on those accounts and ready to watch. Thank you so much, and please enjoy the show.